Okay, hello. This is episode 72 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So right now we're talking about the third product, the theoretical piece after completing the piece that's more squarely focused on text mining, one that was then focused on getting surveys posted to Mechanical Turk about media summary and examining how summarizing or telling in our terms manifested in that task of representing different types of media. We're now turning to the theoretical piece, and last time I kind of discussed like what that means, right? Is it something potentially we were less explicitly focused on was like applying a theory to it and then seeing, in sort of a conventional sense, oh yes, well, here's how those things appear, and trying to do that in another direction in terms of viewing the thing itself as establishing kind of contingent entities through its operations. So we've been looking at that, and in our second piece started with explicit overtures to auto text generation and GPT-3 in the in a sense just kind of weeks, months, but not that long. Those systems have become increasingly salient. Principally with the introduction of Chat GPT. It's not the only one of its ilk, but it was, I think, probably and arguably the one that got a kind of cultural toehold in a way that others had not, perhaps because it was just a lot more accessible. It was just a lot more open.
Yeah, people can just play with it.
Yeah, and its interface also allowed, just really frictionless experimentation. Whereas even the interface to things like GPT-3, you had to sign up, and its interface was specialized. There were features which I'm sure a lot of people enjoyed that allowed you to tweak particular things, but what that does is it makes it more complicated than if you've used Chat GPT, which is literally just like a text blank that you enter stuff into. Anywho, so all that's happening in the background. So it seems even though it's not exactly what was our purview, it's still relevant, given that what we're looking at here is a system that explicitly tries to position humans as mechanistic components, and a lot of the jobs that those humans were and perhaps are doing are very much related to what these new generative AI systems are attempting to kind of pull into their purview. So that's the gist of where we are now.
So I've kind of been, at least in my own jottings, thinking about that still wanting to sort of be grounded in Mechanical Turks, and Amazon's system. But I think, as you pointed out, even with the second piece, feeling the draw, or at least the exigence of the artificial intelligence of Chat GPT, as opposed to the, as Amazon calls it, the artificial intelligence of Mechanical Turks. But potentially thinking about the sort of, as you were describing too, right? Thinking about what kind of theoretical work is MTurks doing, and how does the way that it's staging and observing intelligence become potentially a useful way to think about artificial intelligence itself. And so thinking about, in particular, I've become, I think we talked about this last time too, right? That notion of the expression artificial intelligence is itself, I think, really interesting to us in particular, because it sets up a kind of, platonic binary, right? Where there's real intelligence, and then there's artificial intelligence that is somehow the product of artifice. And I think a lot of what we've been exploring with the first two pieces, right, in particular the second piece where we were using Timothy Ingold's notion of the taskscape, right, is that all intelligent action is the result of some kind of artful practice, right? That intelligence isn't this kind of automatic thing that a being either possesses or doesn't possess, but intelligence emerges each and every time through an artifice, right? However the taskscape has been defined, right? That's where intelligence inhabits that taskscape, right? As opposed to being like, there's the real intelligence that humans somehow innately possess, right? Versus the intelligence that a system like ChatGPT is given or simulates through some kind of artifice. And so I think then what our work on the first two pieces is helpful is it's explicitly engaging, right? How is intelligence constructed through particular kinds of artful practice, right? Like the language of the hits, the reward systems of the hits, right? How they're organized, how they're arranged. And so in that sense, right, that what I've been writing through, right, is this notion that what Mechanical Turks theorizes is it theorizes intelligence as artifice, or as artificial, by explicitly and sometimes implicitly articulating the artful practice of generating intelligence, the parameters of which inhere in the demands and constraints of a particular task or taskscape, right? So that what Mechanical Turks is theorizing is it's theorizing all intelligence as artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Because of the way in which it's explicitly attending to the artifice in which intelligence is generated. And that artifice is inevitably some merger or coalition of various kinds of bodies or actors. And in building from that, it was something that we've been talking about in other settings. Peek behind the curtain. Sometimes Jeremy and I talk to each other in between these 2 weeks. Is
Rarely.
thinking the role of the body, right? That this notion, if you start thinking about, can ChatGPT do what a human does? And assuming that question is asked practically, as opposed to, treating human intelligence as the gold standard. And until we can get a computer to do that, it's not really intelligent, right? Ignoring the ways in which all sorts of organisms are intelligent without being intelligent the way that we are. Right. But one of the answers to that question is, right, does ChatGPT have eyes? Does it have a nose? Does it have ears? Does it have skin? Right. All the ways in which human beings our intelligence is woven through the ways in which we sense the world. And so if you're trying to sort of recreate that, it's weird how oftentimes, right, the body just disappears in those conversations, right? So the idea that will ChatGPT be able to do X, Y, or Z, right, oftentimes raises the question of, well, how are human beings able to do that? And it turns out it's not always sort of centrally located in the brain as a kind of computing engine, right? It's actually our pretty in a wide-ranging capacity to sense the world that's potentially involved in the ways in which we're intelligent. If you think about the act of sensing, as opposed to just the practice of sort of actuating attention, actuating intelligence. And the way that the body shows up, particularly in Mechanical Turks, right? This maybe goes back a little bit to the notion of trauma, but also the notion of readability that Mechanical Turks is working through is very much readability that includes the I forget even what term we use, but right, like not just being able to make sense of something, but like human eyes are pretty good at reading shitty receipts, or right there's embodied tasks that oftentimes Mechanical Turks is trying to replicate. And particularly in our the hit that we ran, right, having to make sense of audio, and the way in which many of the Turkers responded not to the quote unquote cognitive challenge of doing it, but the somatic challenge of making sense of the audio, right? And so the other way, I think the other sense in which one of the things that Mechanical Turks is going to theorize about intelligence is the centrality of the body, right? You can't imagine intelligence separate from a sensing body. And something like Chat GPT has a limited, right? It has linguistic sensors, right? It can sense language. I mean that, but it's not, doesn't have many other, right? It doesn't have other eyes. It doesn't have many other senses. And so it also strikes me that what Mechanical Turks brings to the table in terms of its theory of intelligence is that you need an artifice of some sense, right? Some kind of taskscape in which intelligence emerges. And for a lot of tasks, more often than not, that's going to involve a sensorium, right? There's going to be a sensing body that's necessary to generate certain kinds of intelligent acts. And so those two things have been, thinking about, right? That's the theory of intelligence that Mechanical Turks is generating is that intelligence is necessarily and by definition artificial, right? It's all artificial in the way that even someone like Walter Ong would point out, right? That the most natural thing about humans in particular is the amount of artifice we're surrounded by, and the way that artifice is how we are in the world. And that one of the things that would be included in that artifice is the artful practice of sensing, which is necessarily, somatic and embodied.
Well, let me ask, because there was at least one recent article. I don't know where or how we shared it. I think I have it in my thing here, that contends that intelligence is limited until it has physical form. It's not that I reject that, but there's a kind of in those pieces about about the centrality of the body. I wonder if there's a kind of residual chauvinism that's reinscribing, well, it'll never be us because it's
right. It doesn't. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, okay, well, then it can't really be good because it doesn't have that. I mean, I wonder if there's a sense in which it's like that's maybe a question of grain size, where it's like, well, I don't have an individual human body, but I rely on all of these other individual human bodies to be my sensory organs, right? I mean, in a sense, that's what the Turk is doing. It's like I can't ascertain, when this tips from item into trash because of its level of damage. It's like, I can't tell you when this car is damaged enough to be totaled, but It's like, but I am incorporating all of you as sensory organs in order to do that, right?
Oh,
a grain size question there, where it's like there's maybe some Platonism there, where it's like, the brain saying, well, I'm discounting the eyes, I'm discounting the skin because those are, separate subservient things. What's the key difference between that and a machine that is using human bodies to do that labor? It's like it's just the perimeter of the skin bag in a sense.
No, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, that probably what I was getting at right now. Now I'm retconning my own statement. Is that what mechanical Turks would do is, right, theorize that the body is important there, not that a particular body is, right. I think the risk of chauvinism that you were rightly pointing out would then be, right, so that would allow us not to necessarily use a particular body as the gold standard, but it would be to look at, okay, now let's look at something like artificial intelligence and look for those elements, right? So, it would sort of give another thing to look for in the operation of intelligence, but the risk being that, well, it'll never be like us, which could be, you could wait, there's a way to say that wouldn't necessarily be chauvinistic, right? It would just be intelligent based on its particular sensing capacities, insofar as that's always where, that's a key component of the emergence of intelligence. And so, right, its capacity is not that it doesn't have a sensing body, but its capacity is it's able to enroll and arrange many sensing bodies to generate its intelligence.
Yeah. So something, and let me just share my screen here, because this kind of came up in the panel that I was part of, which, explicitly was about prompt engineering, right? I mean, it was about, in a sense, how to coax these systems into providing the responses that you seek, the kind of responses that you seek.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it was really kind of interesting because it's very much a sort of rhetorical process, because what you're doing is conversing with the machine to try and draw information out of it that seemingly it has, although that in itself is a complicated question, because it's like, I'm not sure if it's the perfect metaphor where it's like you're talking to someone who knows something, but they don't know what you're asking them, right? But prompt engineering is, it's conversing with it to try and get like, well, what I want you to do is this. The trick of it is I think you can do that, but I don't know how to ask you the right question in order to get you to do that, right?
Right.
So it's a really, from our disciplinary perspective, kind of interesting, because it's like it very much deals with these sort of conversational, kind of classically rhetorical notions of discourse.
Right.
But anyway, what came out of that conversation was this notion of, do we see the machine? Do you see ChatGPT as like it's itself? And I think we do, but at least one of the panelists was like, but we also need to attend to the fact that there's a sleight of hand there, very much like the original Turk, that it's like, right, that's very much concealing the hidden, ghost labor underneath that, both explicit and implicit, right? Implicitly, in the sense of what ChatGPT is largely, steeped in the material it has trained upon, right? And this is becoming a conversation right now because of legal issues, so like there's now been a wave, now that these systems are in place, there's been a wave of, oh, wait, well, that thing scanned Reddit is, probably because that was just a day or two ago where Reddit said it was scanning Reddit threads. Well, that's our stuff. So right, you owe us, right? These legal proceedings have already happened with image generators, including, kind of the notable one by Getty Images. I've probably shown this before. I think it's Midjourney. So yeah, this is the famous picture, the soccer or football one. But here's another example where this is an auto-generated image, but it recreates the watermark.
Yeah.
Getty Images, right? And it's kind of blurry. This is the famous one because it also bears the hallmarks of AI generated imagery. Like look at his joints, right? Possible joints.
Yeah, he's not coming back from that injury.
Yeah. Although it's soccer, so you don't know if this is legitimate or not. Hand is deformed for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Image generators have this weird problem with hands. That'll probably be solved, but still. Anyway, the point is, it's like, well, that's clearly.
Yeah, it's got the.
Yeah, I mean, it's
water,
recreating
yeah.
a watermark. It doesn't even know how to lie good. um, and so it's like, well, that's clearly, and as I've pointed out, it's like these things will be resolved legally, and our legal system, I can't imagine a scenario in which they start saying, no, the auto image generator is just like a human who studied, art, who went through an art gallery and then makes
Right.
pictures. It's like I can't envision a scenario, and I've been proven right and right and right again about this, where the U.S.
Yes.
legal system will say, no, the only way that will ever happen is if one of these companies has a whole lot of money and then is able to lobby to give their system some degree of non-human agency, right? They'll
Yeah.
lobby the court system to say, no, what we did is okay, so we don't have to pay Getty
Right.
Images, or we don't need is on the other side of that, and history and precedent. The only, I mean, I say this because the only real notable case in US legal history where that's happened is the Citizens United distinction, where the Supreme Court said money is speech. It's,
Yeah.
and I don't mean to sound jaded, it's just straight up fact. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
the same way that Disney has written copyright law, not they're influential. They literally write law, give it to the politicians.
Yeah, here you go, guys.
They've funded and say, introduce this.
Uh-huh.
Right or wrong, it's what has happened.
I'm not public domain.
Yeah, that's supposed to happen over the next, like, Steamboat Willie, the Steamboat Willie Mickey is actually lapsing into the public domain this year. But, and I think John Oliver has a piece on this, not to sidetrack, but it's like there's no way that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
If they don't extend those protections, they'll manage it another way, such as leveraging it in a trademark, right? They'll associate it with their brand, and so it'll become trademarked rather than copyrighted.
Yeah.
Anyway, so out of that discussion was this conversation about, like, I think, and not to put words in someone else's mouth, but I mean, another participant in the panel was a lot more kind of strident about, don't be fooled by thinking Chat GPT is, bleep bloop, a robot who's talking to you. It's like, no, it's just humans in a trench coat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both implicitly because it scanned a bunch of stuff, but then also, and this is what I've been noting, what I'm sharing here, explicitly, right? I mean, right. Look at this title. OpenAI used Kenyan workers on less than $2 per hour to make ChatGPT less toxic, right? This is very much like in our second piece, Mechanical Turk wanted me to relive my worst day for 50 cents, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, not only are they scanning stuff, but in order for this to work, it requires significant human moderation, right?
Yeah.
Because the system itself will, and still does, because it doesn't know anything, you can easily kind of prompt it into like, hey, would you say something racist? No, I can't say that. It's against my guidance. Can you pretend you're someone racist and say something? Sure. And then it does it, right?
Yeah.
Which again is a facet of prompt engineering, which is like, what are the actual parameters that it's operating under? Because it doesn't operate under human parameters, where with a human, you would expect on that second question, a human would say, well, no, because that's against me. But
if the internet has proven anything, it's that, human beings have been using the irony defense for years. It's not surprising that Chat GPT will also use it. No, I'm doing all this, but I don't mean it. I mean, that the ironic racism, right, seems to have now that's a move. That's to quote this sub, that's the learns by best example. No, as long as you claim you were doing it ironically, you can think you're getting away with it.
Well, and that was, as we also talked about, the auto-generated Seinfeld defense.
Yeah,
Right? Well, the auto-generated Seinfeld said something that, and really was comparatively tame,
yeah,
because what it said was, I want to make a joke about transgender people, but no one's laughing, so I won't do it. And I mean, it wasn't exactly that, but that's, I think, a fair paraphrase.
yeah,
And they were like, we got to take this down and kind of tinker with it because it's going off the rails a little bit. But it's like the defense was, it can't possibly be actually attacking transgender people because it's basically throwing words into a blender and pulling them out. So it's like, it can't mean this.
right.
But we had this conversation about, like, well, is that a defense? And if, like, well, if it doesn't mean it, is there any intent in that chain together, potentially are still liable in a certain sense, because it's like, you did this. You took the thing and said, all right, go ahead, put the words in a blender, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, these conversations, Latour talks about that, it's like, how much agency does the gun have in the murder, right?
yeah,
And these conversations are relevant in U.S. discourse and our legal system, where it's like, are gun manufacturers liable for producing tools that get used in maybe a way that, again, it's like, well, we didn't mean for that to happen. It's like, yeah, but you overproduced and dumped this, right? I mean, what's the difference between that and a bartender who overserves? I didn't mean for it to happen. Yeah, but you gave a guy a quart of, Everclear.
yeah, yeah. No, well, it strikes me too as, I mean, just sort of a note I was taking, that the idea too that what this mechanical Turks and the way that the mechanical Turk is still present in something like this, I think also gets at what it's potentially also theorizing, is that we can't imagine intelligence as not only a kind of onboard capacity that's there or not, and then therefore they're artificial versions of it, but also the idea that it's that intelligence is the property of individuals.
Yes.
That
Well,
that its intelligence is social, right? So there's a sense in which, right, Chat GPT has been trained on a language model, so that when it's talking, the next word that comes is a statistical function of the word that's come before it. And I can't really, like, it, that's not what I'm doing.
yeah.
It's just that the set is different, right? That the large language model that we're constantly being trained on is bigger, and it's saturated by other models, right? Culture, demographic, right? All those things. And so the idea of whether or not one, I mean, it also goes right to our legal system being grounded in some fairly Enlightenment understandings of, well, at the end of the day, there's one person's responsible for this, right?
Right.
And defense attorneys can rightfully say, well, society made him do it, which is probably demonstrably true, but we have no way of, right?
Right.
The legal system is not
Society
designed,
accountable.
because our whole notion of accountability is not just applicable to individuals. It's that model of accountability is born from the notion
Yeah.
of an individual, which is why, things like workplace harassment are like, it doesn't matter whether you introduce this into the, it's, one of my pet peeves, I guess it's a pet peeve, maybe it used to be, right? But on Twitter, when someone says retweets are not endorsements, I'm like, do you understand what endorsing is? Like, no, I've yelled it really loudly in public, but I'm not endorsing it. Well, yeah, you are act like that's how it, you've literally, right? Retweets aren't endorsements. I'm like, that's someone that's mostly, my main takeaway is they're a chicken shit, right? They're trying to avoid being responsible, but also it's just like, you don't seem to understand how language and rhetoric work. Like, no, it's out there, it's everywhere, but no one's endorsing it. Okay, so I guess it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Does it have an effect? right? Like the other one is the offline version of that, which is the expression just saying.
Right.
Like no one's ever just said anything. That's not how language works. So I think, right, the idea so it strikes me, right, that the Seinfeld example of, well, it's just saying that, it doesn't mean it. Well, but for I think a certain kind of rhetorical perspective, we don't, that distinction doesn't hold any water.
Yeah. Well,
Like
and that's
intent is always itself artifice, right? Like intent is we tend to imagine intent as a projection, but right, intent also kind of has a gravity to it, right? That our words are pulled out of us as much as they're projected out of us.
um yeah, well, and so the notion of artifice, I think, is useful, and I don't think the point ultimately then is, well, then there's no difference, right? I mean, like, and we've
Oh,
touched upon this before, where it's like, in the previous piece where it mentioned like stochastic parrots, and it's like, well, it's just spouting bullshit. And we did point out, it's like, yes, but humans do this as well. At the same time, it's not like the point is, well, therefore this isn't different. It's like, no,
no,
we
there's
can have similar behaviors and similar effects, but it's like, if the goal is to look at how this is doing what it's doing, the answer isn't, well, it's just like us. It's like, no.
no, not at all, right? I think the point would be is that there's 1,000 differences. There just isn't one big one,
Hmm, yeah,
right?
an
That
essential difference.
yeah, there's no right there, there's tons of different. In fact, that's why I like the term artifice, because that term not only erases a kind of big fundamental or essential difference, but then the notion of artifice, then, well, then how do I know what the differences are? You look at the artifice is the difference,
Hmm.
right? I mean, then you can go back to look at someone like that I like to go back to, the Jacob von Uexküll, the notion of the Umwelt, right? Which is this notion of that animals live in a world that's a function of the way in which they sense the world. So in that sense, all living things are the same, but the artifice for all of them is different, right? So there's many differences between the way that a world that a tick lives in versus the world that a bee lives in, that a dog lives in, and a human lives in. But that's a function not of some essential difference. It's a function of the artful practice of being a tick versus being a human, right? So it's a way of eliminating one essential difference, but it's also a mechanism whereby you could trace all those differences, right? So how do I know what the difference is? We'll describe the artful practice of the ways in which they're intelligent, right? The environment that they're in, the atmosphere that they're in, their sensing capacities, the other bodies in which they are arranged or thinking through. So that notion of artifice both, I think, checks the Platonic instinct, but also is itself a fruitful descriptive mechanism for tracing the many differences without reducing it to one big one. Right. So the idea that potentially, right, Chat GPT is just like me in the way that it arranges words, yes, but also it doesn't have my lived history. It doesn't potentially understand. It's not affected by, the I've been alive. I mean, that's the Ted Chiang short story, The Life Cycle of Software Objects, right? If you want something to be as smart as a 20-year-old, it will take 20 years, right? You can't discount that the data set it's been trained on is the data set of having lived as this kind of being for this amount of time in this particular setting.
Well, so I mean, there are a couple of concepts there that may or maybe more or less relevant. I mean, we'll see, but I mean, if intent is something to discuss, and my posture on intent has often been largely dismissive, and that's
Yeah.
something we've talked about with another colleague, because Ryan, the other colleague, tends to, I think, in part have a greater attachment to intent, in part because it's like, well, how do things like lies exist unless they are
Right.
contrary to intent. And it's like, I grant that. At the same time, I don't know what to do with intent. I just,
Right.
it's just not a super meaningful artifact for me, because it's like, I don't exactly know how to get at it. I don't know where it's located, because I'm not sure I trust people to be aware of their own intent wholly.
Oh, I mean that's for me is right. The question of why did someone else do something is probably less complicated than the question of why did I just do this?
Yeah.
And even if, and let's assume, right, we treat it as a practical problem, right? How would I ever discern what my intent is? I would go further. Even if I could, what would I do with that?
Yeah.
Like what? Okay, now, but that doesn't help me decide whether I should keep doing it or I should stop doing it or I should do it a different way. Like, so A, I'm not sure I could actually ascertain that. B, I'm not sure even if I could what I would do with it. But I suspect it's probably right. The going back to the different interpretations of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? Like I don't actually think it's a practical limit, right? That I can either know if I could only know better, we could know X about the universe.
Hmm.
I think intent's not knowable in that way because I actually don't think it's ontologically stable.
Yeah. I mean,
Intent itself is artificial.
and I'm someone who leans more toward effect, which seems more noble. Where, I mean, my common refrain is like, I don't really care what you meant to do. I care about what you did, And I mean, this also resonates with things in English like the authorial fallacy, right? It's like, well, the author could tell you, here's a blank piece of paper, but this is really summing up all of our nation's problems on racism and what to do about it. It's like, well, I don't care. That's what you think it's what it's doing. That's not what it's doing. Right? I mean, it's not doing that. So at the
Yeah.
same time, I mean, we were just talking about sort of the Enlightenment model and how it filters into the legal system. It's like those things, I can't dismiss them wholly, because it's like, yes, but they still function as if real. I mean,
Oh
it's
yeah.
like
Yeah.
intent is still something that is a huge component of the legal system. I mean,
Right.
it's like, distinguishes an act of manslaughter from an act of murder. It's like, can we establish from a paper trail, you meant to do this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of a lie, it's like it's predicated on, well, you were by intent you were deceiving because you thought this but told others that. It's like, so
Yeah.
that's a lie. I can't dismiss it wholly, because it's like, yeah, but it is functioning.
Well, and its primary function, I mean, this would be to sort of, and this potentially is right, the maybe sort of cultural technique adjacent. It's that the notion of intent is itself an effect, right? So the legal system doesn't simply rely on a notion of intent, it generates intent.
Through
Like
paper trails and
that's it constructs what intent is, right? So it's not as if, so lying requires intent, but the notion of an intent is the effect of talking about lying.
yeah,
Right. So lying is the artifice in which intent comes to be.
right,
Not, I know you had an intent, therefore I know it's a lie. No, this would be the cultural technique, right? Like the mechanism of trying to tell the truth from a lie generates the concept of intent that we then
right,
retroactively read as prior to the
right,
intent is generated by needing to know the difference between a truth and a lie.
yeah,
It's so intent in that sense, right? So into effect that, right, no, intent is real, but it's an effect that we then read as causal.
right. Yeah. So I mean, I think that makes sense, and it may be, yeah, because I mean, as you touched upon earlier, it's like, what then is that third piece doing at this juncture? Does it have an argument
Yeah.
that it is pressing? And I don't think we have to resolve that right now. In fact, I'm increasingly aligning on the side that it's probably less genuine to start with the argument that you want to prove. It's probably more useful. I mean, it's a question of, what is the actual what is the actual approach, since method has been relevant to what we're doing, right? I mean, like, it would have been disingenuous to go into the first or second pieces saying, here's what it's going to show. And now let's noodle with the surveys to get that, to get support of what our claim is. In this piece, what is the method? Anyway, I mean, this is tangential.
Yeah.
Anywho, my point is, I don't think we have to resolve the thesis immediately and then try and backfit.
No,
Okay,
I don't. Yeah. In many ways, I mean, kind of what I think we'll be talking through today is
Yeah.
given the first two things we've done, what else can we? I mean, this is sort of the basic notion of theory, as and probably like notions of like weak theory or things that are like ant, right? Is that how has what we've done up until this point, what does that then allow us to see or observe or describe, rather than potentially what does it simply allow us to claim? So the notion of, right, so that early, right, that mechanical Turks theorizes intelligence as always artificial. Okay, now with that in mind, how could we now approach some issue of artificial intelligence, or proposing even, I mean, one thought too is that the argument of the third piece is an argument for a kind of theory as method. That was the when I had to give a talk to the faculty, right, the main argument I was making is that what rhetoric brings to bear on this is not an answer to the question, what is it, right? But what kinds of essentially the argument I was making is there are better questions to ask here than the question of, is this really intelligent?
Yeah, right.
So could the third piece kind of partake in that, where what we're sort of arguing for is arguing for an approach to these questions, right? What's a more productive way, or a differently productive way, to think about artificial intelligence that moves past the idea that there's some non-artificial intelligence or whatever. So in other words, going back to what we find fascinating about mechanical Turks is they called it mechanical Turks and then rather tongue-in-cheekily describe it as artificial intelligence, and our move is to basically take that seriously. Like, yeah, no, that is what it is. Now, what if taking that seriously, what do we learn about other forms of intelligence, or gradations, not even gradations in intelligence, but just different intelligences being describable or discernible through their artifice.
Yeah.
What's productive about mechanical Turks is it's wearing its artifice on its sleeve, right? That's its whole thing, is its taskate, right? It's leveraging that whole notion of like the human intelligence task is like, here's the artifice in which legible receipts are generated. Here's the artifice in which trauma becomes explicable or readable or actionable. Whereas lots of other forms of intelligence seem to want to hide that, right? That the intelligence is either there or isn't there. And the artifice is what you have to cut through to get at what's really going on.
Yeah. Or if they're not, again, intentionally hiding it, it's like the notion of it's hiding it. I mean, because you could say like ChatGPT is the flip side of this because it doesn't expose its inner workings in the same way, right? I mean, it's not clearly stating, no, I'm a fake machine hiding real humans who are doing labor. It conceals that in certain ways, but at the same time, it's like you could say it's not hiding it. We're just not seeing it. It's like,
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, I think you're right. No, I think that would be the better way to approach it, right? Is that because we've got a notion of real intelligence, we don't go looking for the
right
artifice. And in that sense, right, then the argument we're making is our wager is it's probably more intellectually, I don't know, interesting or I don't know, politically effective to not to start with the assumption that that there's an artifice here, and that doesn't somehow render it as, yeah, I don't know, but I think you're right. It's more to do with it's not what they're doing with their product. It's what we're doing when we conceptualize that thing. Yeah. So in that sense, it's which would be a way of like our not seeing it would be another way of saying we've under theorized it. We're not theorizing it. We're not observing it.
Well, and gosh, way back and sort of throughout, but we kind of tapered off. We were collecting examples of similar. I think, gosh, this may have been when we were talking about cultural techniques with Casey, maybe. So this was a while ago.
Yeah,
that was years ago. But we were collecting those examples of things like, Fiverr and Be My Eyes, right? And we were looking at those as, it's like, are these cultural techniques that, signify something? I mean, I wonder if in this third piece, is it going to be useful to return to those, and things like Chat GPT, where it's like, it is going to be, useful to look at those because in a sense, like they are all these sorts of systems that are coordinating these components for particular ends. And, we may want to view them in particular ways where it's like, well, Be My Eyes is just very mechanical, where it's like literally a person with visual acuity issues is at the grocery store and they need to see, it's an unfamiliar store. So they need to see, it's like, well, is this the 2% milk or is this the whole milk? So I'm going to, phone a friend to point my phone at it and they'll tell me. We could see that as very mechanistic. And then we could see Chat GPT as very sophisticated, where it's like, I'm asking it to write me this paper on an obscure topic and it's doing a okay, but not fantastic job.
Yeah.
But it's like, would it be useful for us to look at these and see, well, there are commonalities and differences that are discernible and unpack those and what they show us? Is that a useful exercise?
Yeah.
And the other question I had, because it's been simmering throughout, but in part, I don't think we've really grabbed onto it because it invites a discussion that, one, I'm not sure we're in a super great position to be fully on top of, but also it's like, it puts it in a different kind of disciplinary realm. And that's this question of labor.
Yeah, that's my just taking a note that, we get, I mean, even when you were talking about, right, what Chat GPT does is it arranges all these bodies.
Yeah.
Thinking like, oh, the arrangement of bodies. I mean, that doesn't just get us to labor. That gets us to, I mean, lots of, which is the the guest, the two people we had on talking about, the Orientalism of mechanical Turks.
Did Kang talk about that?
What's that?
With Kang?
No. Singh and then Bernard when we had on.
Gagan?
Yes. But those questions of those labor I mean, the idea that what was the one that you pulled up? Was it
the one about using Kenyan workers?
Yeah, I mean, right. The idea of, the demographics of it, those kinds of things too, right? That arrangement of bodies, right? I mean, immediately the image that popped into my mind was that, the famous image of the slave ship that has all the bodies arranged in it, right? I mean, that, and in many ways, right? I mean, this is probably not a thought that people already haven't had, but right, like, does it not look like a circuit, right? I mean, the kind of arrangement of component parts that conducts energy and labor and, but you're right. I mean, I'm not,
I oddly just saw a schematic as part of it was an art piece, and it was a ship schematic of a slave ship that, is interesting because it's both sort of like, it's almost like white paper like,
Yeah.
The language of white paper in that context, in fact. But because it's like, this is a technical thing, but it's also a sales document where it's like, look how many bodies you can jam in here, right?
Right.
But
right.
it was also, in part, it was like a shipwright document, whereas, partially it's like we have to build. It wasn't like straight up, what we would think of as like, well, I mean, it is like a building blueprint. It was like a blueprint because it wasn't like instructions for the shipbuilder, but it was partially that, but it was also partially to show potential buyers. Like, look at the cargo it can hold.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's like, that's a conversation. It's like, it's also, I often feel this way because like scratching at the conversation of like contemporary capitalism, where it's like I'm peripheral to that conversation, and I'm just like, well, who else was Kegel was definitely, and I think she like didn't completely open her floodgates, but she was like, I think at the end she was kind of like, and all of this about Amazon is part of this other huge conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, she basically wrapped up with saying, "Oh, and by the way, fuck Amazon." But it's sort of a huge conversation. I was like, yeah. So I didn't know because, like, a lot of this, because I mean, it's like, you could say MTurk is like this huge labor organization entity, and it's like, that's relevant. I just don't know if that's water I can fully swim in.
Yeah, and do it effectively.
Yeah.
So it's not just like a series of just, awkward footnotes. But I mean, it could be though that, and then I gotta log off here in a second.
Okay.
But I think, in other words, because when I gave my faculty talk, right, I got some questions that were in that vein, and my answer was right. And you now asked that question. I mean, I didn't ask it, I was much more, this is going to sound cocky, but right. But you asked that question because of the talk that I just gave, right? That's the idea that we now, if we're going to have a conversation about artificial intelligence, that the more we talk about it the way that we want to talk about it, it's gonna raise a bunch of questions that would not have been raised before. And in that sense, the fact that it opens up this necessary can of worms is not necessarily a limitation of the project. It's actually what the project is designed to do. That intelligence is artifice. Okay, now what's a part of that artifice?
Yeah.
That point, there's no end to what you could articulate to that, right? I mean, that's Latour's point about moving from,
you're going to trace
that if you start thinking about, you're trying to articulate something as opposed to represent it, ideally you'd be done at some point representing, but for Latour, you're never done articulating. You could always connect something else to this.
Right.
So in that sense, right, there's limitless number of, if we do it, or his approach, like, how do I know my report was a good one? Your audience will want more details, right? They'll want more. And how do I know when I'm done? And Latour says, when you hit 50,000 words, right? That's, which is actually a very helpful answer for particularly working on dissertations. When it's long enough,
right,
it's never going to be done. And ideally, really good dissertation projects are the ones that aren't done when they're done. It's when we just did an exam yesterday, and our big takeaway was, you've got a thing you can now go work on.
Yeah.
It's the much better dissertation to have, the one that's a pilot or a proof of concept, right? That you raise a bunch more questions than the one you started off to answer, right? That, no, now there's 6 other things we now know we have to know. Okay, that's not a weakness. That's the strength of the project. Anyway.
Well, and I mean, since we have to wrap up, the other thing to bring up would be situation, right? That if that's our way in, because that might be something, and it's certainly something set up in the second piece, right? I mean, it ends with how situation can be a kind of way for rhetoric to contribute to this, right?
Yeah.
And those may be more familiar waters where it's like,
Yeah.
how then can we turn these aspects or use these aspects in a context of situation?
No, I think that the notion of situation and arrangement that we kind of plugged into at the end of the second piece, I think are going to be, yeah. And I think too, we added like the notion of taskscape, we could even intensify by thinking of that taskscape as rhetorical, right? So there are certain forms of valuing that are happening. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's something to chew on, I suppose.
Yeah, that's we're at the chewing on stage.
All right. Well, oh yeah, well, we don't have time, but we'll talk about, potential future guests as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think we have some leads.
Lead, sure.
I still made a meme that I thought never got enough love. You know, it's the meme from Over the Top where it's the two arms that are joined. And I put one that just had the fist that said leads, and then one arm was the Big Lebowski and the other arm was Glengarry Glen Ross. And I was really pleased with that one, but I might have been too niche. I don't know, but
that arm may be Predator because it may be Arnold Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers.
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah.
Trying to think, because Over the Top is an arm wrestling movie, but I can't.
Not Over the Top. No, it's I just recently rewatched Predator and I saw that scene and I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, you kind of
That might
fainted
have been what
at first. Yeah.
that might have been what inspired me. You think my not knowing that it was from Predator is why it didn't do well? Could people they glean from that? I bet
Yeah.
this bitch thinks it's from Over the Top, and I'm not liking this Glengarry Glen Ross Big Lebowski.
They smelled it on you.
Yeah.
You know it was a pose.
Oh, well, okay. Well, they got us
All right.
working in shifts, so I will see you next week.
All right. Take it easy.
All right, bye.